The story of the Mexican-American War is not simply a tale of armies clashing on distant battlefields. It is the story of how a young, ambitious United States collided with a fragile, newly independent Mexico, two nations standing on the same continent but moving in completely different directions. By the time the war ended in 1848, the map of North America had been permanently transformed. Vast regions, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, shifted from Mexican to American control. The consequences of that shift would echo for centuries. But to understand how it happened, we must go back to a United States bursting with confidence and a Mexico struggling to survive. In the early 19th century, the United States was swept up in the powerful idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the American Republic was destined, even morally obligated, to expand across the continent. Politicians cited it. Newspapers celebrated it. Settlers believed it. This idea was the wind at the back of a nation convinced that expansion was its natural right. But for Mexico, manifest destiny was a threat. Emerging from years of internal instability and economic turmoil, Mexico lacked the resources, population, and military structure to effectively govern its vast northern territories. These were lands rich in natural resources but sparsely populated and vulnerable to encroaching settlers, raiding tribes, and political unrest. Nowhere was this more visible than in Texas. After inviting American settlers into the region in the 1820s, Mexico found itself overwhelmed as thousands poured across the border, many refusing to adopt Mexican customs, language, or law. Tensions rose, rebellions broke out, and by 1836, Texas declared independence. Though Mexico refused to recognize this new republic, the United States embraced and supported it. The border between the two nations became a line of simmering hostility, especially over the disputed stretch between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. It was this contested land that would soon ignite a war. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico viewed the act as a direct provocation. For Mexico, Texas was still theirs; for the U.S., it was a rightful American territory. President James K. Polk, an ardent believer in manifest destiny, saw the moment as an opportunity, not only to solidify Texas but to potentially acquire the vast northern lands Mexico could not fully control. He sent an envoy, John Slidell, to Mexico City with an offer to purchase California and New Mexico. Mexico refused to even meet with him. Diplomacy had reached a dead end. Polk responded by ordering General Zachary Taylor to move U.S. troops into the disputed borderland near the Rio Grande. This was no accident. Polk knew that placing an American army in territory claimed by both nations increased the likelihood of a confrontation, and a confrontation could justify war. In April 1846, it came. Mexican cavalry crossed the Rio Grande and attacked an American patrol, killing or capturing several soldiers. Polk seized the moment. He declared that American blood had been spilled on American soil, ignoring the ambiguity of the border, and asked Congress to declare war. The vote passed. The Mexican-American War had begun. For the Mexican leadership, war was not a choice but an inevitability. National honor demanded resistance, and popular outrage made negotiation politically impossible. Yet the divisions within Mexico were severe. Leadership changed rapidly. Regional factions competed for control. And amid this turmoil, one figure returned to the center stage, General Antonio López de Santa Anna. Though exiled in Cuba, Santa Anna convinced U.S. diplomats that he would return to Mexico and negotiate peace. The Americans allowed him passage. But once he arrived, Santa Anna betrayed his promise, rallied Mexican forces, and prepared for war. It was a calculated gamble, one that would shape the coming conflict. The war began with a swift American advance in northern Mexico. Taylor's army captured key cities including Monterrey, and though a temporary armistice was granted, Polk was dissatisfied. He feared Taylor was becoming too popular, too politically threatening. So Polk shifted the war strategy. Instead of relying solely on Taylor, he launched a bold plan, a direct amphibious assault on Mexico's coast, aimed at capturing Veracruz and marching inland to seize Mexico City. For the United States, this was an unprecedented military campaign, one that demanded naval strength, logistical precision, and unwavering resolve. For Mexico, it was a sign that the Americans intended nothing less than total victory. As 1847 approached, both nations braced for a war that would decide the future of North America. From California's remote settlements to the halls of Congress in Washington to the battlefields of northern Mexico, tensions were rising, and the stakes had never been higher. The conflict was no longer simply about Texas, it was about the fate of an entire continent. And as the armies marched, fought, and endured brutal hardships, the map would soon be reshaped in ways neither nation could fully predict. As 1847 dawned, the Mexican-American War entered its most decisive phase. What began as a border dispute in the contested lands of Texas was now transforming into a full-scale continental conflict. The United States, driven by ambition and confidence, prepared to strike deep into the heart of Mexico. Meanwhile, Mexico, fractured politically, economically strained, but fiercely proud, braced itself for the most formidable challenge since its independence from Spain. The next year would determine not only who won the war, but what the map of North America would look like for generations. The first major American offensive of 1847 targeted Mexico's eastern coast. General Winfield Scott, already a respected military leader, was chosen to command this audacious operation. His plan was bold: land thousands of troops by sea, capture the strategic port city of Veracruz, and then march inland toward Mexico City. It was the first large-scale amphibious assault in U.S. history. And it signaled that the United States was not content with defending territory, it aimed to invade and occupy the Mexican heartland. In March 1847, Scott's forces assembled off the Gulf Coast. The landing at Veracruz was a spectacle unprecedented in the Americas. Thousands of American soldiers climbed into surfboats, forming long lines that stretched across the water. Naval guns boomed overhead. The city, surrounded by thick fortifications and anchored by the towering fortress of San Juan de Ulua, watched as the American invasion unfolded. Yet despite the risks, the landing was nearly flawless. Within hours, more than 10,000 U.S. troops were ashore. The siege of Veracruz began immediately. Scott encircled the city with trenches and batteries, cutting off supplies and hammering the defenses with relentless artillery fire. Inside the walls, civilians suffered terribly. Disease spread. Food dwindled. After 20 days of bombardment and desperation, Veracruz surrendered. It was a major U.S. victory, one that opened the road to Mexico's interior. But it also exposed the brutal human cost of modern warfare. The fall of Veracruz was a turning point. The United States had gained its gateway to the capital. For many Americans, the capture of Mexico City confirmed the belief that the war was just and destined. For many Mexicans, it was a national tragedy, a humiliation that exposed political instability, military weakness, and foreign exploitation. Yet even in defeat, Mexican pride remained unbroken. Now the question turned to peace, and to the future of the continent. As the occupying army settled into Mexico City, diplomatic negotiations began. Both nations were exhausted. The United States had achieved decisive military victories, but the cost of continuing the war was mounting. Public opinion at home was turning more critical. Many Americans feared that prolonging the conflict would deepen tensions over slavery and expand political divisions. Meanwhile, Mexico faced famine, poverty, and government collapse. Peace was no longer a preference, it was a necessity. President Polk sent diplomat Nicholas Trist to negotiate a treaty. Initially, Polk expected Trist to secure vast additional territory, perhaps including northern Mexico or even parts of the capital region. But once Trist arrived, he discovered that pushing too hard would only prolong the war and deepen Mexican resistance. Quietly and against Polk's wishes, Trist began negotiating reasonable terms. On February 2, 1848, the two sides signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty was monumental. In exchange for $15 million and the settlement of Mexican debts owed to U.S. citizens, Mexico ceded nearly half its national territory. The United States gained California, Nevada, Utah. Most of Arizona. Half of New Mexico. Parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The Rio Grande was established as the official border of Texas. It was the largest territorial acquisition in American history after the Louisiana Purchase. And it redrew the map of North America permanently. But the war's end did not resolve every conflict. Instead, it opened new ones. The addition of these vast western lands intensified debates over slavery, statehood, and political power, tensions that would contribute to the Civil War just 13 years later. For Mexico, the loss was a painful national memory, shaping its politics, identity, and foreign policy for generations. Yet from the ashes of war, both nations rebuilt. The Mexican-American War had redrawn boundaries, but it also forged new relationships, new migrations, and new cultural identities across the lands that once divided the two peoples. The next part of the script will explore the aftermath, the geopolitical impact, the legacy, and the reshaped American West that emerged from the war. The signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 did more than end a war, it opened a new chapter in North American history. The ink on the treaty had barely dried when the United States found itself in possession of a vast sweep of territory stretching from the Rio Grande to the Pacific coast. Overnight, the nation grew by nearly one-third. With this expansion came new opportunities, new conflicts, and new questions about what it meant to be American, or Mexican, on a continent whose borders had suddenly shifted. In the immediate aftermath of the war, thousands of U.S. soldiers began to withdraw from Mexico City and the surrounding regions. Their departure was chaotic but symbolic. The war was finished, but its consequences were only beginning. Meanwhile, in the newly acquired territories, life did not instantly transform. Towns such as Santa Fe, San Diego, and Los Angeles remained largely Mexican in culture, language, and law. The people living in these territories, Mexicanos, indigenous nations, Californios, Tejano, and countless mixed communities, woke up one morning to find themselves citizens of a different country. The treaty guaranteed their civil rights, property, and cultural protections. But reality was far more complicated. As American settlers poured westward, conflicts emerged over land, identity, and political power. Many Mexican landowners, who had held vast ranchos under Spanish and Mexican law, suddenly faced U.S. courts, new taxes, and legal systems designed around English documents and American property norms. Land grants that had been respected for generations now required proof that many families lacked in written form. Lawyers, speculators, and opportunists swooped in, contesting boundaries and acquiring property through legal maneuvers. Within a generation, much of the land once belonging to Mexican families passed into Anglo-American hands. Yet the cultural transformation of the West was not a simple story of replacement. It was a story of mixing, blending, and adaptation. Spanish architecture continued to shape cities like San Antonio and Santa Fe. Mexican food, music, and traditions spread into the growing American culture. Catholic missions remained central landmarks. In California, adobe homes stood beside emerging American-style towns. The cultural border between Mexico and the United States did not align neatly with the new geographic border. It continued to flow, shift, and expand. The war's impact was also deeply felt among indigenous nations, who were suddenly thrust into a new world of American expansion. The Navajo, Apache, Comanche, Ute, Pima, and countless smaller groups found themselves facing a U.S. government determined to control the frontier. Under Mexican rule, indigenous relations had been inconsistent, sometimes hostile, sometimes diplomatic. But the United States brought with it a systematic approach to Western expansion, marked by the creation of reservations, military campaigns, and forced relocations. The clash between indigenous autonomy and American settlement would shape the next 50 years and alter the demographics of the Southwest forever. Meanwhile, the American political landscape was undergoing dramatic transformation. The lands gained from Mexico intensified the national debate over slavery. Would these new territories enter the Union as free or slave states? The Wilmot Proviso, introduced during the war, attempted to ban slavery from any acquired territory. Though it failed to pass, it exposed the deep divide between North and South. Every compromise, whether the Compromise of 1850 or the later Kansas-Nebraska Act, was a temporary bandage on a wound that was growing deeper and more dangerous. The Mexican-American War, in many ways, laid the foundations for the American Civil War. The same generals who fought in Mexico, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, George McClellan, and others, would one day face each other on opposite sides of a far bloodier conflict. Many of them later reflected on the Mexican War with discomfort. Grant famously wrote that he considered the conflict one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker. His sentiment echoed a growing belief that the United States had taken advantage of Mexico's instability to achieve its expansionist goals. Yet despite criticism, the war altered the American identity in ways that were impossible to ignore. The acquisition of California would soon prove to be one of the most valuable events in U.S. history. Just months after the treaty was signed, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The California gold rush erupted, drawing hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers from across the world. Chinese merchants, Chilean miners, European adventurers, and Americans from the East Coast all poured into the region. What had been a sparsely populated Mexican frontier quickly transformed into a global crossroads. San Francisco exploded from a quiet village of a few hundred people to a bustling port city of tens of thousands. New roads, ports, and railways followed. The discovery of gold accelerated California's path to statehood and cemented the importance of the Pacific Coast in American politics, trade, and migration. The war had expanded the nation, but the gold rush ensured that the West would not remain a quiet frontier. Farther inland, the territories of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah experienced slower but equally dramatic changes. New American military posts appeared. Mission towns evolved into new settlements. Mormon pioneers established a thriving community in the Salt Lake Valley, eventually forming the backbone of the Utah Territory. Trails, stagecoaches, and later railroads linked the Southwest to the rest of the country. The vast landscapes that had once seemed distant and foreign became central to the nation's sense of destiny. For Mexico, however, the aftermath of the war brought deep wounds. The loss of territory was not simply geographic, it was psychological. It triggered national reforms, political upheavals, and movements to strengthen the country's identity. The decades that followed saw struggles between conservatives and liberals, foreign invasions, and internal revolutions. Yet despite the trauma, Mexico endured, rebuilt, and developed a national pride forged partly through the memory of resistance. The new border, drawn through deserts, mountains, and rivers, would become one of the most significant geopolitical boundaries in the world. Over time, it shaped migration patterns, economic relationships, and diplomatic tensions. For generations, families living on both sides navigated divided homelands, shared cultures, and cross-border identities. The line on the map was political, but life along it was deeply human. The Mexican-American War, short as it was, lasting less than 2 years, permanently reshaped the destiny of the continent. It set the stage for the rise of the American West, the decline of indigenous autonomy, the growth of railroads and industry, and the emergence of the United States as a continental power. And it left Mexico determined to preserve its sovereignty and rebuild its sense of unity. But the war's impact did not end in the 19th century. Its legacy continues today, in culture, politics, demographics, and diplomacy. The borders created in 1848 still define millions of lives. The lands ceded by Mexico became home to booming American states. And the shared histories of the two nations remain intertwined in a complex relationship shaped by conflict, cooperation, and migration. The next section will conclude the narrative by exploring the long-term consequences, modern implications, and how the war's legacy continues to influence the U.S.-Mexico relationship in the 21st century. By the mid-19th century, the map of North America had been permanently altered. The borders drawn in the wake of the Mexican-American War were not simply political lines, they were cultural, economic, and historical boundaries that shaped the destiny of millions. The war had ended in 1848, but its ripples would continue to spread through the decades, influencing everything from immigration patterns to civil rights movements, from indigenous sovereignty to national identity. The legacy of the conflict remains alive today, visible in the landscapes of the American Southwest and the shared heritage of two nations. In the years following the war, the United States faced the challenge of governing its newly acquired lands. The territories were vast, diverse, and home to communities with traditions stretching back centuries. Anglos, Mexicanos, indigenous tribes, European immigrants, freed African Americans, and Asian migrants all lived within these evolving frontiers. The American government introduced territorial administrations, built forts, and encouraged settlement. Railroads soon stitched the region into the national fabric, turning once remote deserts and mountain valleys into accessible corridors of commerce and migration. Yet the most profound change was demographic. The lands gained from Mexico became some of the most ethnically diverse regions in the United States. In Texas, California, and New Mexico, families traced their roots to Spanish colonists, indigenous nations, and ranchero traditions. Their heritage became interwoven with Anglo-American customs, blending into a hybrid culture that continues to define the Southwest today. Spanish place names remained. Catholic missions persisted. Ranching traditions merged with American cowboy culture. The war might have shifted borders, but it could not erase memory or identity. As the United States expanded, the question of slavery grew ever more pressing. Would the territories taken from Mexico become free or slave states? Every new decision dragged the country closer to internal conflict. The Compromise of 1850 allowed California to enter as a free state and created new territorial boundaries for Utah and New Mexico. Yet it also introduced the Fugitive Slave Act, igniting fierce opposition in the North. The Mexican-American War had launched the nation into a new era of political upheaval, one that would explode into the Civil War in 1861. Many Civil War generals had gained their first combat experience on Mexican soil, where they learned strategy, logistics, and leadership. Robert E. Lee, who scouted at Cerro Gordo, Ulysses S. Grant, who marched through Mexico City, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who fought in Scott's army, all would later use those lessons on far deadlier battlefields. Writing later in life, Grant reflected on the Mexican War with guilt, believing that the conflict was motivated more by expansionist greed than just cause. His words echoed a sentiment shared by many Americans who questioned whether manifest destiny had been used to justify an unnecessary conquest. For Mexico, the war's legacy was equally complex. The loss of nearly half the national territory was a deep national wound. It triggered political reforms and contributed to a rising desire for modernization, unity, and resistance to foreign influence. Leaders like Benito Juárez would later steer the nation through reforms known as La Reforma, pushing for separation of church and state, land redistribution, and a more centralized government. These reforms were, in part, attempts to prevent the political chaos that had weakened Mexico during the war. Economically, Mexico was forced to rebuild and refocus on its remaining territories. The northern lands lost in the treaty would later become home to major American cities: Los Angeles, Phoenix, San Diego, Denver, and Santa Fe. For many Mexicans, this transformation served as a reminder of what had been taken. Yet Mexico also developed a strong sense of national pride and identity in response to the humiliation, embracing resistance as a defining element of its character. This identity remains visible today in celebrations of its independence, its military history, and its cultural traditions. Despite these conflicts, the cultural blending continued to shape communities on both sides of the border. The new boundary created in 1848 was not simply a line, it was a meeting place. Families crossed it regularly. Trade flowed along it. Languages mixed. Festivals, foods, and traditions traveled freely. Even after the U.S. tightened immigration laws in the 20th century, the cultural exchange never stopped. The Southwest remains one of the most multicultural regions in the world, a testament to the shared history born from the war. As the decades passed, the United States strengthened its position as a continental and global power. control of California gave the nation a gateway to the Pacific, opening trade with Asia and enabling the rise of San Francisco and Los Angeles as major ports. The deserts of Arizona and Nevada later became hubs of mining, technology, and tourism. The mountains of Colorado and Utah drew settlers, scientists, and pioneers. The war's territorial gains paved the way for railroads, highways, and eventually aerospace industries, making the region a powerhouse of American innovation. Mexico, too, evolved into a significant regional power, with a growing economy, rich cultural heritage, and influential global presence. While the memory of the war remained a source of national reflection, Mexico transformed its identity from one defined by loss to one defined by resilience and creativity. Its music, cuisine, art, and traditions spread across the continent, influencing American culture as deeply as American political and economic forces influenced Mexico. Today, the border created in 1848 remains one of the most discussed and contested in the world. Issues of immigration, trade, security, and cultural identity continue to spark debates in both countries. Yet alongside those tensions exists a powerful and enduring connection: millions of families, businesses, workers, and communities living in intertwined worlds. The Mexican-American War may have divided territory, but it created a shared cultural landscape that no treaty could fully separate. In the end, the war reshaped more than a map. It reshaped identities, economies, and futures. It set the stage for the rise of the American West, the development of modern Mexico, and the cultural richness of the borderlands. It revealed the consequences of ambition, the costs of conflict, and the enduring power of resilience. More than 175 years later, the war's legacy still echoes across deserts, city streets, mountain passes, and coastal plains, from the missions of California to the pueblos of New Mexico, from the barrios of Texas to the bustling streets of Mexico City. It is a reminder that history is not merely written in treaties, it is lived in the people and places that carry its memory.